Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. My name is Dorothy Kinney-Landis and I work for Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District. This is the first webinar of a two-part mini-series on reclaiming waste, and that's focusing on using what might be considered as waste as agricultural inputs and resources. This first webinar is about why farmers spread manure, and then next week on Wednesday at 6 p.m., the webinar will be about urine nutrient reclamation for clean waters and fertile farms, and that will be hosted by the Rich Earth Institute. For those of you who might not be familiar with Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District, we are one of 14 conservation district NRCDs in the state, and our mission is to empower and partner with land stewards and communities on the ground by supporting connections that benefit natural resources, water quality, soil health, and the working landscape in Franklin County and across Northwest Vermont. Much of the work we do involves communicating and collaborating with farmers, land stewards, organizations, and community members to support our local ecosystems and land-based economy, and also foster understanding about how to best manage our natural resources to meet numerous goals. And so that's where today's presentation comes in. There's probably a lot of questions around why farmers spread manure. This presentation is geared towards folks who might not be directly involved with agriculture, or at least agriculture that deals with managing manure. Maybe you've driven by a farm and seen a farmer out there on their field. You might have a lot of questions as to how do they know how much to spread, or how do they know to spread today, or what is the equipment they're using? And so we'll hope to answer some of those questions and gain some more understanding about what goes into manure management and why it's a great resource. In this presentation, I'll cover the basics: what is manure and how do farmers store it and apply it. We'll go over manure application regulations and best management practices. I'll talk about how manure is a resource and its role in nutrient cycles, nutrient management planning, which is very important for how we're managing manure. And then I'll end on innovations in manure storage and application and agricultural clean water progress. So what is manure? As defined by Vermont's agricultural water quality statute, manure is livestock waste in solid or liquid form that may also contain bedding, spilled feed, water, or soil. It can come from all animals that farms might be raising. Very common in Vermont, we have cows, sheep, goats, horses, chickens, all sorts of things. And I'll say that manure management is regulated in Vermont per Vermont's required agricultural practices. So the required agricultural practices guide a lot of practices regarding manure management. So I'll briefly give a little bit of background as to what they are. They are a set of rules guiding certain farm operations that were developed off of a number of prior programs and laws. These include the Agriculture Non-Point Source Pollution Reduction Program and the Accepted Agricultural Practices. In 2015, Vermont passed its Clean Water Act, or Act 64. And as a result of this, the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets was tasked with updating the accepted agricultural practices and established further requirements and guidance for farms as to how to manage their nutrients. The goal of the required agricultural practices is to reduce non-point source pollution affecting water quality coming from agriculture. And this is done through setting standards and requirements and providing recommended practices to farmers. And the RAPs were developed in collaboration with a lot of people, including farmers and technical service providers, to establish guidance. The RAPs apply to all farms, but the requirements will vary depending on the size of the farm, and that's based off of how many acres a farm manages, how many animals they have, what types of crops, or how many acres of different types of crops they are growing. And so some of those requirements include nutrient management planning, water quality training, and different standards. In this presentation, I will mainly discuss manure management as it applies to manure that is collected in large quantities, such as liquid manure in a manure pit or solid manure in a field stack or in a barn. This management requires a bit more work from the farmer in holding it and spreading it than it does in grazing contexts. When animals are grazing and they're out in pastures, they do the work of spreading manure themselves as they're walking around eating. But even in these contexts, there are practices that relate to manure management. That includes rotational grazing, fencing, and waterway exclusion. But farmers use these practices in relation to manure management to really keep the manure on the field where it can get back into the soil because they don't want it getting into waterways or areas where it might pose a problem and it's not useful to them anymore. I don't know if these pictures are from a Vermont farm, but they're hanging up in my bank in Burlington. And when I see them, they're a little bit scary. We don't want to see cows or livestock right in our waterways. And so when I see this, I'm a little bit concerned and I sort of laugh and I think, I hope this farm gets some more fencing because if the manure is ending up in the water, it's not great for water. It's also not doing any good for the farm. The farmer is losing out on those nutrients. So what form manure is in and where and how it is collected is influenced by a number of factors. This includes the number of animals on the farm, the species, and the stage of life those animals are in. Manure management for a dairy cow that spends more time in a barn or in a milking parlor will look a lot different than it does for, say, a heifer that's spending more time out in a pasture. Winter manure collection is also a really important factor. While many animals might spend a good portion of the year outside grazing, in the winter, they might not be able to access enough forage to feed on, or the grounds are covered in snow, or it's too cold. And so there does need to be some manure collection, especially for, the animals that are all gathered together in a barn or in a farmyard. And then there's just certain areas of the farm where manure collection needs to happen, such as near that barn or farmyard or near a milking parlor. So first we'll look at manure stored in a liquid or slurry form. This is very common on dairy farms in Vermont. The liquid is contained in a manure pit, which can be made of metal, concrete, or earthen. It can be above ground or in ground. And a lot of the reason that it's more of a liquid consistency is because it contains water from washing milking equipment or stormwater runoff from the barnyard. And since this water is coming into contact or potentially coming into contact with the animal manure itself, it must be managed in the same way. Alternatively, manure can be in a solid or semi-solid form. And this is often because it's mixed with barn bedding. Although if you look in the upper right at that chart, you can see that some animal manure is just naturally more solid. If you look at the poultry manure versus something like the pig or the cow manure, poultry manure is naturally more of a solid manure. And some farms have a combination of solid storage and liquid storage. So they'll have both types. Standards and regulations for manure storage are specified in the required agricultural practices, and these are typically consistent with Natural Resources Conservation Service or NRCS standards. For liquid manure storage, there are specified setbacks and minimum distances from things like wells, surface water, property boundaries, roads, and structures. They also must be sized appropriately based off of the number of animals a farm has and how long, during the winter they might need to be collecting manure. And these structures are designed by engineers licensed in Vermont and typically to NRCS standards. Alternatively, solid manure that's held in a field stack, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a stack of manure. Also has some rules to where it can be placed on the farm. There are minimum setbacks from wells, surface water, property lines, and tile drainage. And there are also specifications for what soil types they can be placed on, depth to bedrock, and they can't be located in areas that are subject to flooding or in floodways. So once the manure is collected, it at some point must be applied to fields. The first step of this is pumping it out of a pit or scraping it out of a storage area, where it is then transferred to a spreader. You can see in the upper right photo, that's what getting the manure out of the pit could look like. There are a lot of ways of applying manure to the land. It can be broadcast across the land surface, as seen in the middle picture. It might be incorporated with tillage, or it can be injected right into the soil, which is in that bottom right photo. The manure in a liquid state or a slurry state is actually pumped through those hoses and into the ground directly. And that's actually a really cool technology. So I have a video about what that looks like.
You're looking at the future of nutrient management and improved water quality in Vermont.
You know, if I was a layperson and I wasn't a farmer and I saw it, other than the hose, I might think they were planting something in the field.
This is the Grassland Shallow Slot Manure Injection Tool. And in the next few years, it's likely to become the way to spread manure.
If you get some decent regrowth, you can still get out there and put on manure without worrying about ruining the crop.
At this dairy farm in Bridgeport, farmers, state officials, and equipment dealers have gathered to watch a demonstration of this new technology. Kirsten Workman is a UVM extension agronomist.
It's injecting liquid dairy manure literally just 2 inches under the surface of the grass plants. So this does very little disturbance, almost no true disturbance of the soil or the plants. It's just making a slot and then dropping the manure right in that slot.
The injector is hooked to a drag line that pumps manure from a nearby pit. 60 cutting blades make a narrow slot in the ground, and the manure is injected under the surface. From below or above, it doesn't look or smell like manure is being spread on this field at all. And that's the point. How long have you been using the injection?
This was the first time.
What do you think so far?
Looks good so far.
The host of this event is Dan Barnes. He and his family operate the Black and White Base Ranch. He believes this technology has significant potential for protecting natural resources.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that field, you can't see a lot of manure there, which is what we want. We want it down, covered up, and down where the roots are.
Yeah.
The plants can use it. Potentially, we're capturing more of the nitrogen. It's not just kind of flying away in the air as we're applying it, or before it gets soaked into the soil and attached to a soil molecule or a plant group. That's the big driver for me.
Typically, when manure is applied to a hayfield, it's spread on top of the soil. When it rains, some of the nutrients in the manure, like phosphorus and nitrogen, can wash off and end up in waterways. The decision to use the injector came out of the research Workman and her colleagues did on phosphorus runoff from hayfields.
We realized that this dissolved phosphorus running off the surfaces of hayfields in the summer was a higher risk than we really thought it was. Because hayfields are low erosion, we think of them as being lower risk than an annual crop field. But that's not necessarily always the case. And in Vermont, we have more acres of hay than we have in annual crops by a lot. And so that can be a potentially very large, risky situation. And so we recognized that, identified that, and we started looking into what could be the best technology.
This is one of the largest manure injectors on the market and costs around $100,000. UVM Extension received a grant from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets to buy it and to subsidize the cost of its operation for 2 years.
Okay, so I'm actually going to pause it there. That's a program called Across the Fence that's produced by UVM Extension. So if you look up on YouTube, Manure Injector UVM Extension, you can watch the full video. And they have a lot of other videos and programs that are really interesting and allow you to see what's going on in Vermont agriculture. All right, so manure application is regulated in Vermont and must be according to nutrient management plans for certified small farming operations, medium farming operations, and large farming operations, and that's based off of the number of animals and the acreage that those farms are operating on. And so part of the regulations for the required agricultural practices is this winter spreading ban, which goes from December 15th to April 1st, or for some fields that are considered frequently flooded, it's a little bit longer from October 15th to April 14th. And this is for a few reasons. First of all, if the ground is frozen or covered in snow, if manure is applied to it, it's just more likely to run off into waterways. And then also in the winter, if the plants are dormant or if the field is not yet planted, there's nothing growing to actually take up the nutrients in the manure. So they're not actually doing anything if you're applying them to the ground in the winter. And additionally, during the growing season, manure shouldn't be spread on fields if there's going to be like a heavy rainstorm or if the field is saturated or has been recently flooded, because again, we don't want that that manure getting into water. I will say that while the winter spreading ban is the standard, there are exceptions. Typically, these exceptions are due to weather, such as a very wet spring that might prevent a farmer from accessing fields. And so, say like in March, if there's a lot of rain and it's filling up those manure pits, but we haven't yet gotten to that April 1st date where they can start spreading, a farmer might have to seek some other options. And so for farmers who might need an exemption, they work with the Agency of Agriculture to find a solution. This might mean spreading on low-risk fields or spreading when the weather is suitable. So if it's late March and there's a field that is already clear of snow, has warmed up a little bit, that might be a good option. And in some cases, it just might mean transporting manure from one storage location to another. So why put so much work and resources into managing manure? As we've kind of discussed, there's a lot that goes into it. The equipment can be very, very expensive. Engineering and designing and building these manure pits is definitely very costly. So why do all this? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, if farms have livestock, they have manure, so you better plan for what to do with that so it doesn't become a problem. And then as we've gone over already, there are requirements from those required agricultural practices. But then this third piece is that manure is a very valuable resource to farmers, and I want to highlight that a little bit now. So animal manure is often viewed as a waste product or in some cases a pollutant, but it's really much, much more than that. Manure is a valuable organic fertilizer, and my use of the term organic really refers to the form that the nutrients are in and that the manure is in like a carbon-based form, and not referring to certification status. Manure contains plant nutrients that are essential to plant growth, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so much more. And it's not only essential to plant growth, but also the soil microbial community, and so supporting those microbes as well. And then manure also contains organic matter, and so this helps build soil carbon, can help improve soil structure and water holding capacity, improves nutrient retention, and supports that soil microbial community. So manure can also play a really key part in soil nutrient cycles. The first step of that cycle is growing crops such as corn or hay, which use nutrients in the soil in order to grow. These crops are harvested for feed or grazed on directly by livestock. And so then those nutrients that are in the plants go into the animals, where they support the animal growth and things like milk production. But animals don't use all of the nutrients that they are consuming, and so many of those pass through the animals and then are excreted in their manure. And so the farmer can then take that manure and apply it to the field and capture all of those nutrients that were originally from the soil and get it back to the field, where it then can the nutrients in the organic matter can be replenished in the soil and can support the next season's crop growth, bringing us back to the beginning of that cycle. Manure application is not the only way to return nutrients to the soil. Synthetic fertilizers and mineral amendments, such as ammonium nitrate, urea, and triple superphosphate, among others, can be other options for getting nutrients back in soils. One thing about these is that they're chemically simple, which can be great in some cases, such as applying to a field and supporting plants in early season growth. But a downside of this is that typically they tend to be water soluble in that simple form, so they can be lost pretty readily from groundwater or surface waters. And an additional factor to consider with those synthetic fertilizers is just the energy and the resources that go into mining, processing, synthesizing them. For example, to make ammonium nitrate, the phosphate rock, or to make phosphate fertilizers, first the phosphate rock must be mined. And in areas where that's happening, there can be really tremendous environmental degradation and negative impacts to ecosystems and human health and the communities living there. And then processing and transporting those fertilizers also requires a lot of energy and releases a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. Manure is an organic amendment. And again, this is referring to its chemical composition rather than certification status. But organic amendments, other than manure, include compost, cover crops, and plant residues. And these are more chemically complex, and the nutrients are bound to organic matter. And so they're released to the plant more slowly and not lost as readily. In a lot of cases, those nutrients must be transformed by soil microbes. And so those soil microbes are slowly processing those nutrients. And so the organic matter is supporting not only the plants, but also those soil microbes as well. And so again, manure is one option of an organic amendment, but others include compost, cover crops, and plant residues. So as I mentioned, manure contains organic matter, and I'll go over some benefits of that because there's a lot. Organic matter is the food and energy source of soil microbes, including bacteria, archaea, and fungi. And the soil microbial community is responsible for a lot of the work in nutrient cycling and as well as breaking down harmful chemicals, and they can also provide some degree of pathogen resistance for crops. So supporting those communities is really important. On the lower left, you can also see these soil aggregates, and the microbial community in the soil, the living soil community, does a lot of work in helping to create these soil aggregates. And that's just soil that's kind of held together in these little clumps. And the benefit of having a soil structure that is a little bit clumpy is it promotes water infiltration and aeration. And so then when it rains, the water is able to get into the ground, get to the roots, not just run off the surface. And then also these soil aggregates help keep the soil a little bit more stable and less prone to erosion. Soil organic matter is negatively charged, and a lot of the nutrients that plants use are in positively charged ions. And so the negative charge organic matter attracts those positive ions and really holds on to those nutrients a little bit more firmly, so that when it does rain, they're less likely to be washed away. And then finally, organic matter is made of carbon as well. And so increasing the organic matter in the soil increases the carbon in the soil, and keeps it in the soil rather than in the atmosphere. So a little piece of trying to address climate change and atmospheric CO2. So some additional benefits of using manure strategically to support soil health and crop growth is that it reduces the need for additional nutrient inputs, whether that's through purchased fertilizer or purchased feed. If your soil isn't able to support the crop growth that a farmer needs to feed their animals, they might need to be buying feed from elsewhere. And so these are important factors to keep in mind because if we can reduce the need for those additional nutrient inputs or feeds, we can reduce the amount of nutrients imported to a farm or into a watershed, assuming that the manure produced by those animals is not exported out at the same rate, which I'm sure if you've driven behind a manure tanker, you'll recognize how slow they can be, how big it is. And so there's not a lot. Farmers don't want to be moving their manure far. And so this is all important to keep in mind when we remember the purpose of those required agricultural practices, which was to reduce non-point source pollution, which in agriculture, in many cases, can be just excessive nutrients getting into water bodies and causing problems. One nutrient that is an example of, this balance of nutrients being needed for crop growth, but potentially being a problem in water bodies is phosphorus. Crops need a lot of phosphorus to grow, but if too much gets into water, it can be a huge problem and cause cyanobacteria to really dominate. And that's seen in this picture here at Lake Carmine, Franklin, where all this like turquoise and blue colored growth on the surface is algae. And so some of that phosphorus that's getting into water bodies is from agriculture, not all of it though. Agriculture, looking at Lake Champlain, for example, where phosphorus is also a concern. Agriculture accounts for about 38% of the phosphorus making its way into the lake, but also other sources of it include developed land, as well as our forests and wetlands and stream banks. And some of that is from just like natural cycling, and some of that has to do with like our land use and land use history. Now, one of the reasons that nutrients such as phosphorus in particular can be a problem in water bodies is that the amount needed for certain species such as like algae to grow is a lot less than what is needed for crops to grow. So farmers need a lot of nutrients such as phosphorus to grow their crops, but if a little bit of that is getting into water, it can have a pretty sizable problem. And so going back to those imports of fertilizer or feed to the watershed, and for those of you who might not be familiar with watersheds, it's just referring to all the land that drains to a particular water body. And so this image on the right is the Lake Champlain watershed. And so all this land contains, forests, farms, developed land, and various sources of phosphorus. And so farms that need to import fertilizer or feed to their farms, what might happen is that the amount of phosphorus on that farm and in those soils might just increase over time and become excessive in the soils and be at risk of leaching or running off into water, where it can be a problem. And so trying to avoid bringing more nutrients into watersheds can be a really key factor in addressing some of these water quality solutions. And that's where manure comes in. If we're able to use manure strategically on farms to support crop growth and just keep it cycling between the soil, the crops, the animals, and then the manure, and then back into the soil, we can try to keep those nutrients from getting into waterways and also reduce the need to import things like fertilizer and feed and purchase them, because those are just additional expenses to farmers. And if they have manure that can serve the purposes they need of, supporting their soil health, that's a great aspect as well. So we've already covered a lot in this presentation. We've gone over what manure is, how farmers store it and apply it. We've gone over manure application regulations and best management practices. I've talked a little bit about manure as a resource and its role in nutrient cycles. And now we're at this nutrient management planning piece, which nutrient management plans are really important for many farms. For those certified small farming operations, medium farming operations, and large farming operations, the required agricultural practices do require those farms to keep a nutrient management plan and apply nutrients, whether that's in the form of manure or other fertilizers or amendments, or even cover crops. Those need to be reflected and planned for in their nutrient management plans. And those plans are comprehensive documents outlining, for manure at least, where and when to apply manure based on a lot of factors, including soil tests, manure tests, crop needs, and more. And these are often made with support from UVM Extension, Natural Resources Conservation Districts, and other agricultural service providers. And actually right now, UVM Extension is running their nutrient management planning course for farmers who are developing their first nutrient management plan. But every year farmers are updating their plans because they're really dynamic and changing as farmers gain new information. So there's a lot that goes into these plans. It's a lot of information. And really all this information is processed and synthesized to become a tool to help farmers figure out how to meet their crop nutrient needs while reducing water quality risks. Nutrient management plans accounts for nutrients from manure, cover crops, and other sources. And it recommends, for manure, it recommends application for each field, and that's based off of a lot of different factors. And so for farms, farms must have their manure tested every year, and that's from each manure source. So if a farm has a manure pit and a field stack, each of those needs to be tested every year. And those tests report back things like the dry matter, the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients in the manure. Additionally, farmers need to do soil samples for each of their fields at least every 3 years. And so this page shows on the right what one of those soil tests look like. It has at the top some of the major nutrients that plants need, including phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. The soil test also reports the percent of organic matter in soil, as well as the pH. And this is important because pH can dramatically affect nutrient availability in the soil and how nutrients are available to plants. And that's this chart on the left showing kind of different, it might be hard to read because it's a little bit tiny, but it shows the pH scale and how available different nutrients are at different pH levels. And so there's kind of a sweet spot that's a little bit acidic where most nutrients are fairly available. And so farmers sometimes have the right amount of nutrients in their soil, but maybe the issue is that their pH is off, and so those nutrients aren't actually accessible to the plants. One thing you might notice on this soil test is that it doesn't list nitrogen, and that's because nitrogen fluctuates a lot. It goes through a lot of different forms from the soil, it goes into the atmosphere. It's very dynamic and it changes with a lot of different factors, including the season, how moist the soil is, if it's rained recently. And so capturing a result in a soil test wouldn't really be all that helpful because it really likely won't reflect the nitrogen in the soil for very long or consistently. And so those nutrient recommendations for nitrogen are more based off of crop needs, soil type, how much nitrogen is in the manure. Nutrient management plans also outline which fields need specific practices as determined by the required agricultural practices. So this might include cover crops on highly erodible soils or sloped fields. It might specify which fields are subject to that extended winter manure spreading ban, which again is October 15th to April 14th, and those are on frequently flooded fields or soils. It also will specify manure spreading setbacks, and so fields that are adjacent to streams or ditches need setbacks of where they can spread manure, where they can't spread manure, so that it's not potentially getting into that surface water. And farmers are always needing to adjust. This is nutrient management planning, and managing their manure is just very dynamic. And so like, this season, for example, we saw extreme flooding, so much rain in July. And so farms were impacted in numerous ways, in addition to their fields being flooded, crops being flooded, potentially not being able to get on their fields because of flooding. One effect that UVM Extension has been researching was just the impact of all that precipitation on the nutrient concentration stored in manure slurry. And so on the left, you can see that in the darker gray is kind of the range of average, the average range of the percent solids of manure. The dark gray is this year, the lighter gray is average values. And so the amount of solids was greatly reduced. And then on the right, this is comparing the amount of phosphorus in that slurry manure in 2023 from these samples that were taken compared to averages. And so great reductions in phosphorus. And so this year with all this rain, or in 2023 with all the rain, farmers not only had maybe a lot more volume of manure to manage and to deal with because of that rain getting into their manure pits and being captured into storage, but also that manure had a lot lower concentration of nutrients. And so then they have to kind of figure out and work with technical service providers about, okay, how does this affect what I need to do on my fields, and how do I manage all of this when it's different than what I was expecting, which is always the case. So now we're at this last piece, which is innovations in manure storage and application and agricultural clean water progress, because I want to highlight some really cool developments. So on top of running their farms and keeping their nutrient management plans up to date, many farmers in Vermont are also being really proactive about protecting water quality and championing innovative ways to utilize manure. One of the strategies is to figure out better ways of composting manure. Composting manure prior to application tends to make phosphorus less soluble in water and therefore less likely to run off. And there's a lot of work going into figuring out better ways of composting it. The Vermont Phosphorus Innovation Challenge is a statewide effort supporting multiple projects working on creating scalable technologies that capture phosphorus from manure and produce commercial composts. And many farmers, in addition to that work, many farmers are also adopting these bedded pack barns, which allow manure to be composted with a carbon-based material that's used as bedding. And so part of the benefit, as I mentioned, of this is it makes the phosphorus a little bit more stable, and other nutrients a little bit more stable, less likely to be, I'm forgetting the word right now, but less likely to get into waters, and dissolved into waters. That's what I was looking for. And so some of this work also has to do with figuring out ways to inoculate compost, which can speed up the composting process so that farmers might even be able to use that compost that they've collected for the winter that next growing season. And then another piece is maybe figuring out ways to pull certain nutrients like phosphorus out of manure. And so that could be great if, say a farm has too much phosphorus in their soils and they don't need more of it, but maybe they could use that product and sell it. So some very cool opportunities and work going on there. And another thing I'll talk about is just some developments and opportunities related to equipment. Farmers and agricultural service providers have been working on developing better ways to apply manure. One piece of equipment that is becoming more common is a drag line. And we saw that in that video I showed where that hose is connected to the manure injector. And they can be connected to manure injectors or broadcast spreaders as well. And these hoses are connected to the manure storage area or a tanker. And so rather than having the tanker with the manure and the spreader, driven on the field and adding a lot of weight to the field, you can just have this hose that's connected to somewhere off the field and just have the spreading equipment. So like the tractor and the manure injector on the field, which really reduces the weight on the field and reduces compaction, which is, a concern for farmers and will impact soil health. As we've discussed a little bit, manure injection is becoming more common, and there's a few benefits to that. One is that by putting the manure into the soil, it reduces nutrient losses from, losses of nitrogen especially, and also phosphorus. And then also farmers don't need to then incorporate the manure with tillage, so reducing disturbance to soil. And another benefit is it reduces the smell, which I'm sure many would be happy with. And then finally, there's a lot of work and development related to precision agriculture. This includes flow meters and GPS that allow manure to be applied at really precise rates, even changing those rates within a field. So you can, if a farmer knows that, maybe part of their field has sandier soils or shallow soils, they can adjust in their GPS and in their monitor settings how much gets applied to different areas. And then additionally, there's some developments in real-time nutrient sensing of the manure that's being spread, because what is being spread, the nutrient composition might be a little bit different than what is reflected in that annual manure sample test. And then also there's real-time soil mapping that's being developed, which again can help farmers be really precise about how much manure is being spread in different portions of their fields. I'm gonna take a little sip of beverage right now. So to close, I want to touch on how much progress the agricultural sector has made in Vermont to reduce the amount of phosphorus losses associated with farming. Agriculture can get a lot of negative attention, and farmers are often blamed for water quality issues, especially in Lake Champlain, where there is a phosphorus issue that people are working to address. And while agriculture does contribute a sizable amount of the phosphorus in the lake, about 38%, it's also agriculture and farmers have been responsible for a lot of the reductions of the amount of phosphorus going into the lake. Since 2016, the agricultural sector has been responsible for about 96% of the phosphorus reductions. And a lot of that has to do with just improving management, storage, and application of manure. So I hope that you learned a lot about manure management, all that goes into what farmers need to know about how to store and apply their manure, but also learning about why it's a really valuable resource. It's not just a waste that farmers need to spread on their field to get out of their way. It does a lot for the soil. It really supports our agricultural and food systems in Vermont. And so I'll end by asking if you have any questions. I'm sure there's more. Feel free to pop them in the chat. Raise your hand.